Hey gang, hopefully I can thread the needle on this one. Of course, I fully expect the usual cluster of comments from people who haven't watched the vid, but think of this as cashing in on the latest PvP versus PvE drama, but we'll soldier on in spite of that. So in this one, I'm going to dive into some of the mechanics and systems that should hopefully be making their way in. Hopefully not in the far too distant future, that CIG has talked about in the past, or that I just think would be helpful, but mostly the CIG one. So if that sounds good, let's get this. I feel I should start this out by saying that, believe it or not, what we're playing right now is not a finished product. Shocking, I know. But this isn't the usual, it's an alpha excuse. For one, that one's getting a little old, as some of these things probably should have been in place a long time before some of the other things that CIG prioritized. But here we are, we got the game we got for right now, because it's an alpha. Regardless, there's a good bit of things that CIG has talked about over the years that should make the current experience a little more balanced between the two camps, the PvP and the PvE camp. But how? Well, that's the question that most MMOs have, really. And it's really, really hard to get that thing right. But first, I want to touch on why this is a controversy at all. And I'm still not convinced this is a whole community thing rather than just a very vocal minority from both camps. I think the majority of people playing this game are kind of like me, older and have been playing a wide variety of games, both PvE and PvE included. I have no doubt that there are extremists out there who can't accept that the other camp is let into their game, but here we are, a game that's somehow claiming to be made for both. And before we get into this too far, I'll lead this off with a caveat that I don't think enough content creators express. This is my opinion. It's an opinion based on following and gaming in this project for over a decade, but still just my take based off of what CIG has said over the years and my own conclusions based on that, and no kidding around, just wish listing by me. There's pretty much zero reason to think that CIG won't evolve or even flat out trash an idea if it isn't working or the community rebels against it. So for example, do you remember hover mode? I do. Anyways, I've always thought, actually one of the reasons I made this channel in the first place, that part of the fun of Star Citizen is trying to fill in those gaps between what we want, what CIG has said they'll eventually give us, and what we have right now in this ever-changing, ever-breaking madness that we call Star Citizen. So that's enough of the caveats. Let's get into the weeds a little bit. So I lied. Let's address my take on the 4.0 controversy. And yeah, there's a few this preview build has brought, like people being locked out of their accounts. But hopefully those are mostly clear by the time this vid drops. No, I'm talking about the people flooding into the lawless system of Pyro and discovering the harsh reality of what lawless system actually means when you have a human player base. I won't spend a lot of time on this, I don't think, because I think pretty much every content creator for this project and beyond has given their own 2 cents on what's going on here, and I won't be adding a whole lot to the conversation. Instead, I'm going to try to explain where the crux of this frustration is coming from both camps. And I swear I will tie this into the solutions we'll eventually, hopefully, be getting in the not too distant future. So the big controversy, if you're somehow not aware by this point, is that PvE players are getting blowed up by PvP players and they don't like it. That's a bit simplistic, so let's just say, actually, let's get into why it's frustrating, and frustrating for both camps in this situation. Let's start with the PvE view. Now, I'm going to mostly focus on the industrial-focused PvEers out there, because I think the bunker runners and bounty hunters that go after NPCs are at least expecting some combat, and are at least kitted out to deal with it. Even if their skills are more aimed at derpy NPCs, they're more or less designed to let them win. Instead, I'm talking more about the person that's out there mining in a prospector, salvaging in a vulture, maybe even a reclaimer, mining in a rock planet side like I'm doing in this background vid, or just hauling cargo. In all of these cases, except maybe cargo hauling, but actually, yeah, cargo hauling too, now that you need to manually load and unload your ship. Anyways, in all of these cases, it can really take a lot of time just to get the thing that will eventually make you money. And that's if you can get to the place that buys that thing. And if the tick rate for the server is lined up. And if that commodity isn't at saturation at that location where you're trying to sell it or buy it at if you're in the trading loop. So here's a more specific example. I'm out in my Zeus, a rock loaded in the back, flying low and slow across a randomly selected stretch of Magda. I mean, I'm not a total idiot. I don't fly right down to a ground location and fly out from there, because that's an easy location for anyone and everyone to get to. And they will typically start their hunt for someone like me at one of those locations. So anyways, I fly down to the surface and start pinging. And pinging and pinging. Sometimes I'm lucky and I find that glorious Haydenite node right off the bat. But typically I'll sedately fly around pinging madly for 20 or 30 minutes. Sometimes longer. Sometimes a lot longer. And then I'll get a hit. Another 30 minutes, all those rocks are broken and hoovered up. So all told, even for someone who's pretty experienced at this game and knows where to look, just finding one Haydenite node and mining could represent an hour or more of gameplay just to get the ore. I know in my case, while I drop in Star Citizen almost every night, I usually only have an hour or so to play if I'm lucky. So finding that one Haydenite node might represent all the time I have to game it that night. So now let's say that someone in, say, a Hornet, or now an M50, according to Avenger 1, who I definitely trust on this particular subject, decides to shoot me down. I'm in a Zeus. I have a near zero chance of winning that engagement if the fighter pilot is even moderately competent, just because of the nature of those two ships. The Zeus just can't maneuver enough to get enough shots on the fighter to actually kill it. So there goes an hour or more of gameplay for me, wiped out in about a minute of combat that I had no chance in. And yeah, I'll get to some of the things I could have done differently, but I'm trying to explain where the frustration is coming from. Now you add in those repercussions for the dude who blew me up. There basically aren't any. 10 minutes in Klesher, barring elevator bugs, and they're out. I've been there too, I know. I've also sped run the escape route many times, and that's about 15 minutes if I'm being extra careful with the jumps, then about 2 or 3 minutes to reclaim my ship, and I'm right back at it. I might get a bounty on me, but the chances another player picks it up are pretty slim, and I could always pop over to Korea and clear my stat there. Bonus that there's almost always at least a chance that I can pick up some PvP at that location too. Okay, so that's the PvE side of this. Hours of work, seconds of badly unbalanced combat, and to add insult to injury, zero consequences for whomever did it. The game starts to feel heavily tilted towards PvP to that PvE player. Fingers off the damn keyboard, I'm getting there. Now let's look at it from the PvP perspective. Star Citizen covers a lot of space. A lot of space. I see the I'm ganked every time I spawn stories too, and honestly, I don't buy them. I won't say there's not players out there that hang around Grimhex or other locations on occasion, or certain areas like Brio's Breaker Yard, and just blow up ships, but that's not the norm. This is anecdotal, but as a former competitive PvP player myself, I'm largely cognizant of the tactics used by the PvP community to find combat. So when I want to be left alone, I usually am. That said, in 11 years of playing this game, I've been deliberately attacked by other players, guesses, 3 times. So these people saying they're getting ganked every 5 minutes, they're either doing something very wrong or they're making it up. So let's go back to that thing about space. Even with 600 people in a server, the chances of you bumping into someone outside of a popular location just randomly are pretty low. Take my example of rock mining. I fly down to the planet manually and start pinging. I'm not starting or ending at Brio's Breaker Yard, a great place to sell illicit but high return commodities like drugs or weevil eggs. And here's the thing, a PvP player can watch the same vids an industrial player does and know that they will see another person if they go to that location, because there's a good chance that someone else saw that same vid too. Again, as a former PvP player myself, I get that rush of being the last person alive on your team and having to win the day through your own skill, basically carrying your team, or going up against someone who's at your level or even better than you and coming out on top. That's a huge rush, I won't deny it. But a lot like when I'm out pinging for Haydenite, if I don't find anything after an hour or so, yeah, that Dolivine starts to look pretty good. It may not be what I was looking for, but it's at least something in the loop that I'm trying to play. The same can be said for a PvP dude looking for a fight. That whole A isn't a challenge, but it's at least another person in a ship that has a chance, in theory anyways, to outfly you and get away, or maybe even shoot you down if it's Avenger 1 trolling someone in a hole A. And sometimes it's just pure boredom and watching another ship go boom and then hearing about them cry about it in chat. Yeah, this game isn't devoid of murder hobos. But the people pulling that stuff, again, are the ones that just want to hang out over Brios and around places like Grim Hex or in Pyro, places where the repercussions are likely to be very low, but the chances of encountering other players is very high. The fact that PvP players tend to team up and PvE players by their nature tend to run solo is another thing that exacerbates the issue, but I'll get to that in a second here. So real quick, there aren't really solutions in the game right now. For PvE players, sure, you can hire or entice org mates to escort you or sit in a turret, but that is a miserably boring job, particularly when it might take an hour or so just to find the thing you're looking for. That's the real reason people don't hop into escort duty. Honestly, there's not many money sinks in this game, so the PvE players are literally just watching a random number go up after a certain point. You can only buy so many 890 jumps before you get bored, dig? So most of the successful PvE players absolutely could afford escorts with their in-game earnings. If you have 3 890 jumps, you can afford escorts, and they probably should do so, but it's just not that interesting a game loop for 99% of the time. Also add to that most PvE players want to play by themselves. They just want to log into the game, do a calming, fun loop, and log off, bugs permitting. The problem is that this isn't Hard Space Shipbreaker or some city builder. It's an MMO. The whole point of Star Citizen is that there's other players out there to interact with, both positively and negatively. So the feeling that the PvE community has, and I'm mostly focused on those who largely want a solo game experience, is largely wrong. But what they aren't wrong about is the underlying mechanics and solutions that should make violent, unwanted, antisocial encounters either less rare or have a greater cost for the person who initiates it than a few minutes of prison time and ship reclaiming. And that is where this episode is finally going. Some of these solutions are much further out than others, maybe much, much further out. That said, let's get into it. With this first preview implementation of server meshing dropping in, we are just starting to see the first glimmers of the game we were promised years ago. The one where 90% of the verse would be populated with lifelike NPCs and we wouldn't be able to tell these NPCs from players. While CIG's walked that lofty goal back a bit, for a long time, it was a hilariously depressing joke. I used to run bunkers in my underpants, taking out derpy ninetails with my bare hands. The NPCs were that bad. But that's not really the case anymore. For one, there are NPCs wandering around outside. They're usually pretty reactive. While they're not as scary or smart as the ones in Squadron 42 demo, and definitely not as scary as a real person would be, I do find myself being a little more cautious when engaging them. And it's not rare for me to walk away with some tier 3 or tier 2 injuries. We're not to the place where there's NPCs filling the skies around major LZs like ArcCorp or Lorville, but that might not be real far off given the state of the servers. But one of the issues right now with the whole PVE PVP thing is that PvP players with crime stat can basically fly right into the safe zone around space stations and not really have to worry about the turrets being able to shoot them down. But that won't always be the case. That isn't to say that a player running for base will be 100% safe when they're in the bubble of a station or landing zone, but it should be something to make going into those zones a lot less hairy for those who are not viewed as hostile or have crime stats, and a lot more dangerous for those who do. And we'll get there in a second too. Second, the better server should allow CIG to start implementing some other solutions. Some good ones that other MMOs have settled on is things like military responses and NPC bounty hunters. In effect, a military response would probably only happen in relatively safe UEE systems, or any UEE system really. Pyro would still be the Wild West, but a place like Stanton should have some response spin up for a particularly violent murder hobo or gang of pirates or marauders operating in that system. So let's quick sidebar here. My definitions of pirate are someone who mostly just wants your stuff, but doesn't really care about killing you. Marauders want your stuff, but will definitely kill you to minimize your ability to perform shenanigans. So shoot first, in other words. And murder hobos are just people who are wanting to shoot everyone for no real gain because that's the fun loop for them. They don't care about your stuff. Anyways, where were we? Right, military responses. This happens in EVE among other games, but basically if somebody goes on a killing or a crime spree in lawful space, law enforcement will eventually get involved. The military will eventually get involved. Right now, the only thing that happens is that a mission is generated and players are expected to handle it. But the number of players that are actually taking those bounties is pretty low, so it's not much of a deterrent. Much less so when most of those bounty hunters are solo and the people they're hunting are generally in groups, making it even less likely that justice will be delivered. With better servers though, CIG can start throwing NPCs at them as the servers will be in place that can actually handle that extra load. And sure, NPCs might not be able to kill the dude, but wave after wave after wave of ever more threatening NPCs might. At the very least, it'll force that player to deal with that threat rather than continue to ceaselessly murder hobo their way across Stanton. There'd be repercussions for their actions, in other words. And sure, they could run for a lawless system like Pyro or Nyx, but there's a good chance that both of those jump points will have a military presence around them, and they'll be actively looking for people with crime stats again, eventually. That'll mean that a player wanting to run away from these ceaseless NPCs hunting them down will either have to surrender, which, let's be honest, they won't, or they'll have to find a way back into the safer, for them at least, system. And that would probably mean working with other players to smuggle them across the border, or finding one of those elusive side jump tunnels, which will also probably take other players with the right gear knowing where they are. And if that particular player has a toxic reputation with everyone, well, let's get into that. This is what I think is really missing from the game right now. A true reputation system. A true murder hobo shouldn't be able to land anywhere if they're blowing everyone up. Even gangs and criminals have codes, and someone who kills everyone is clearly breaking them. In fact, criminals are far more likely to just kill a threat like that than put it in prison for a few minutes. At the moment, the reputation system isn't really implemented. Sure, you can build up a rep with a specific group on some of the lawful missions and even some of the unlawful ones, but there's no real benefits or costs. In other words, if you've been doing bunkers, killing Ninetales for weeks and have a stellar rep with Crusader security, you can absolutely pop right on over to Grim Hex, which is run by the Ninetales, land, and buy whatever you want. Even get healed up. Get your ship refitted and repaired. There's zero consequences for your actions against that game. There's some consequences if you have a crime stat, as you won't be able to request landing at a station, but you can still land on a pad. Wander in the door, buy stuff, even spawn up a ship there and leave. Duty free, you might say. You don't step off the elevator and immediately have NPC security surround you and arrest you, or shoot you down for resisting. Nope, it's pretty much you're just free to go. You can land at LZs, outposts, you get the point. Your reputation just doesn't do much in the game at the moment, except maybe give you a bonus to your mission payout, or make things mildly inconvenient in where you can land. That won't always be the case. And this is one of those things that I think might be coming sooner than later. I also think this will be a check on truly toxic behavior, the murder hobos, because they won't be associated with anyone. They won't have allies. If they're sitting off checkmate station in Pyro, zotting everyone, Rough and Ready will definitely be responding to them violently and will likely hunt them down to remove a threat to their authority. I honestly think the lawless areas should be much more dangerous with the reputation thing, precisely because they are lawless. The mob doesn't deal with people they don't like by negotiation and asking nicely. So the long and the short of it is that reputation will be, or should be, playing a pretty big role in the future, and a much larger role than it does right now. Truly toxic players might find themselves locked out from most of the game, barring their capture or death, simply because they've made enemies of everyone. They could find themselves floating in space in a broken ship they can't repair or refuel, slowly dehydrating to death, simply because of the way they chose to play the game. Now, for the pirates and the marauders, it's a different story, particularly if they align themselves with the council, the overarching criminal guild that'll be coming in eventually. But this will hold true even if they align themselves with the various gangs or factions, various illegal ones. As long as they're not ganking people aligned with their allies, and hopefully that'll be something that's easily spotted in the reputation tools in the game, the gangs won't care. For example, a bunch of pirates interdict some rando Hull C tooling its way through Pyro. No one in Pyro is going to blink. But if that Hull C was associated with Xenothreat and was making a cargo run for them, well, Xenothreat is probably going to care. And at the very least, those pirates' rep with Xenothreat is going to tank. Yeah, rep is going to be a big deal in this game. At least if CIG implements it like they said they would. Short one here, but it fits well with reputation. Actually, maybe it won't be short. And you'll see a theme here. Right now, long prison sentences are just too punishing. It's too easy to get a crime stat, accidentally shoot a guard in a bunker who is aiming his gun at you while standing in front of a hostile, that sort of thing. It's not hard to get a crime stat in the game if you're a careful, lawful player. So dropping someone like that into a week-long prison sentence would likely lead to that person not playing the game again for a long, long time, if ever. And that's bad for all of us. High player population equals good for all of us. It means CIG gets to keep making this weird-ass thing we're all obsessed with. But anyways, prison time. Expect one day the consequences for unlawful actions to start to add up to some real prison time. And the prison asset itself was made in 2019, I think? Earlier? I remember I made a post they should make a prison and have a bunch of gameplay, and then they dropped Klesher on us a couple months later. It wasn't quite what I pictured in my head when I made that post. In my mind, in the description on Spectrum that I left, there were two gangs working each other in this prison, as well as guards and the warden, and all of them were working against each other, and it just generated a lot of missions and loops someone could conceivably engage in to pass the time. Instead, we got Klesher. Now, like a lot of the loops and missions and assets in the game, CIG was bound by the servers, and they couldn't blow a lot of server space and assets on the prison. But as that throttle slowly comes off, CIG might be able to start exploring some options. Part of the goal of Prison, both now and hopefully as the game goes on, is to act as a disincentive, a cost, a repercussion for players who want to break the in-game laws. Note, just break the laws in the game. So playing within the framework of the game, just doing things that are still antisocial. For the people that are truly griefers, CIG has been pretty clear the ban hammer is coming for them one day. One day. It's just right now, true PvP players playing within the framework of the game are getting called griefers. So, yeah. Anyways, Prison. Prison should serve two purposes. First, like real Prison, it should remove a player performing antisocial acts from the larger game and the larger community. A consequence for their actions, in other words. For second, it should be something that allows the player to keep playing the game, so to stay engaged with the game, even though they've been incarcerated. That's a mighty fine line to walk, and the current iteration definitely doesn't do that. There just isn't enough to do in Klesher, and the sentences aren't long enough to really discourage anyone from doing anything unlawful. It might encourage someone to go make a sandwich rather than play the game and wait out their 90-minute sentence. On one hand, the times for incarceration need to go way up, but to justify it, there has to be options for unlawful players to escape to. Places like Pyro, for instance. Prison has to be a real disincentive. People should actually be trying to avoid prison, either by not committing crimes or by being a lot more careful where and when and how they commit them. Right now, if a dude starts getting violent thoughts, they can pretty much act on them with impunity. If the punishment is actually, punishing, if the consequences of committing a crime are high enough that it would impact their gameplay, it should take out the people that are just casually ganking other players. In other words, the ganking would generally be done for an in-game reason, or it should be. I mean, we all have alt accounts, right? Right. Anyways, Prison should work as a consequence, like a real one, in-game. You can have your fun, but there's a price. And speaking of there being a price, nice segue, right? So many ships have LTI. This one doesn't really seem to matter anymore, and CIG really painted themselves into a corner with LTI. But I can see a way out. This would also go for sub-items that CIG is kind of trying to find a solution for, and the latest duping issue just sort of seems to exacerbate it. Before angry fingers fly the keyboard, obviously I'm talking about implementing this once the game is in a more stable place. When your ship doesn't randomly despawn or drop through the world or blow up because you opened a door. When the likelihood of losing your ship or gear is more likely because of some action you took or someone else took on your ship rather than some bug in the game. Again, my solution is more of a time and location based one, and this plays well with what they've said in the long ago, in days of yore, although they never went into a great deal of detail. Let's just fill in some of those details with some solid hopium, shall we? Let's. So here's my thought. Eventually, hopefully, one day, everything in this game will be accounted for more or less physicalized. Even if that physicalization is just this thing exists. In other words, all those components that make up a ship, from armor to the quantum drive to life support to the weapons to the whole ship itself, they're made somewhere. They are transported somewhere to be assembled. They're made from basic parts. Or I guess they're just printed in a Pioneer, whatever. Point being that the ships aren't just magical things that are summoned out of the ether. You need the stuff that makes the stuff, in other words. And that goes for gear too, particularly if it's something special like sub-gear. Now, these are things that people have paid real money for, so CIG can't just say, well, you lost it, it's gone. Lol boobs 4206969 has your stuff now. There has to be a way for a player who bought those things with real life money to get those things back. Now, for the stuff bought in game, different story, but a player could still get it insured, and then it would fall under the same category. The trick is having a system that cuts down on duplications, because really that is what's happening here. You are duplicating an item that is out there somewhere in the verse. Basically, this would come down to inventory. Is that item available locally? For special items like that sub-gear, I think a good solution is if CIG were to say, this sub-gear is made on Earth exclusively. At that point, it would be delivered to the player. If the player were in an unlawful system, then it would be delivered to the nearest safe system. And the time it would take to get there would be calculated by that distance from Earth. So if you're one jump from Earth, not a real long wait. Off on the far side of the Empire, might be waiting a while. Might be waiting a long while. In a place like Pyro, well, your replacement gear will be waiting at a Kovalex kiosk at the Stanton Pyro jump gate station. So you'll get it back, but you'll have to wait, and it'll only be delivered to somewhere safe. This could have the added bonus of creating player delivery missions, which is part of the original goal. So you would create a mission, a player would deliver the item from point A to point B, or an unlawful player could hire that player to deliver it from point B into the unlawful system. Same could be done for ships. Say there's an inventory of X number of cuddies in Stanton that are on the lot, that they're available for purchase or replacements. If there's a run on cuddies, or if someone is spawning and reclaiming their ship every 5 minutes, they're going to blow through that inventory pretty damn fast. And once that inventory is gone, they have to tap the inventory in another system. Again, if people are forced to wait for extended periods, they might be a little more careful in picking their fights, where, when, and who, especially if the short-term solution is that they're given a loner Aurora in the meantime. And talking about insurance, CIG has mentioned a couple times, again a while back, that how you lose your ship, as well as where you lose your ship, will matter. If your ship gets blown up in combat over and over and over again, you might find that no insurance company is willing to back you. Or, since LTI exists on literally everything, you might just end up with trash insurance that still fits that lifetime insurance deal, but only covers the bare minimum. The trick is implementing the system so it doesn't exclusively punish PvP players as a whole. If you're working on the lawful side of the coin, good chance you'll have coverage because you're doing good. But if you're on the other side of that coin, well, thug life has a price, y'all. I know I bring this up often enough that it seems like I think that this will be a panacea, but I mean, it kind of is. Right now, someone in a Fury, a literal snub, could conceivably pop a Polaris or even an Idris. Those are full-blown warships. You talk about something smaller and not, well, warshipy, and it becomes even more obvious. In short, armor should up the time to kill, sure, but it should also do something else. Make larger ships much, much harder to kill for smaller ships, if not completely immune. It should scale. If CIG does it right, so even something like a Connie should be really hard to kill with size 1 or size 2 weapons, if not impossible. And size 3 would still have an issue. Size 4? Well, now you're talking. Fighters should largely be a nuisance to larger ships, not a death sentence. And that's where the balance is right now. If you're in a Connie and a fighter of any size gets on your tail, turret gunners or no, you're probably toast. But that's my hope for armor anyways, that it would scale up drastically. Size 1 guns would really only be a threat to small vessels. Size 2 would probably be small to mediums or like heavy hitters for smalls. So maybe up to freelancers and cuddies. Size 3 would be for those Connie size ships, but they wouldn't do much. And size 4 would start being a threat to things like Star Lancers, Caterpillars, and the like. That would also add the element that CIG seems to be leaning into, that you prepare and bring the gear for the situation you think you will be in. So if you know you're just going after fighters, there's no reason to break out the big guns. In fact, getting a big, harder to maneuver ship would probably be a deficit. But if you're going after bigger game, you're going to need the bigger guns, and the size 1s and 2s will just tickle it. In no world should a bunch of light fighters be able to do much of anything to something like a reclaimer, for example. This would also give purpose, finally, to those heavy fighters like the Vanguard and now the Guardian, ships with guns that can actually punch through that heavier armor. And let's end it on this one. The whole you should pay an escort or turret gunner thing is kind of a joke in the current game, but that won't always be the case. I know I had some fun with my org and in past events, just sitting in a turret, like sitting in a turret on a Polaris. I'm not sure I'd want that to be my entire experience in Star Citizen, but if I was bored and someone in chat threw up an offer to man their turret for X amount of money, I'd probably do it. I've done it in the past. I know others have too. But there's definitely a group of players in this game that just don't want that experience. They don't want another person on their ship. They don't want to take the risk. Or they just don't want to talk to someone else. Maybe this is how they unwind at the end of the day. Maybe they're antisocial or introverted. Who knows? They have their reasons. And let's just leave it at that. You would hope reputation would play a role here, where you could easily tell, hey, this guy has a 1-star security rating and the last 20 ships he's been on have disappeared and their captain's been killed. And you know what? I don't think I will hire this guy. But the reputation isn't doing that right now. And besides, we all have alts, right? Right. Anyway, again, there should be a cost for that in an MMO. And that cost should be NPCs and blades to man their ships instead. NPC escorts, that sort of thing. For NPCs, we saw this in Privateer as well as numerous other games, that the quality of the NPC is tied directly to their cost. You want the greatest NPC fighter pilot of all time that will give even good human pilots a run for their money? Hope you're doing really well in your endeavors, because they're going to cost you. You just want a body and a seat? Well, that's easier. Either way, you'll probably need amenities on the ship to keep them happy. So morale will be a thing as well. So you'll have to cover the NPC's salary at the very least. In a much larger ship like a Polaris, you could certainly solo it with a population of NPCs crewing it up. I have zero problem with that, but you better be doing something that generates enough wealth to keep them all employed. Honestly, this is one of those things that I think will actually drive players towards working together with other players. Industrial solo players won't just be sitting on giant pools of money. They'll need to pay for their crews. That means they'll need to make more money, and they'll likely need to hire escorts. Granted, they could probably hire NPC escorts. Maybe, why not? Who's to say that solo Polaris captain will definitely be looking for people who are willing to pay him to keep him and his crew functioning? Blades. Well, I've talked a lot about blades. A lot. In chat, in forums, even in my own comments section, there's always at least one person that says, I'll just use blades. And I mean, yeah, one-time upfront cost, you get something that you can slot into your ship's computer and it'll control a turret. It sounds awesome. But there are a ton of unanswered questions out there about blades. First, I strongly suspect that the max number of slots a component will have is 3. And that's the larger Class A variety. So read, expensive and rare. It also probably means that the max number of turrets you'll be able to have controlled by blades will be 3. And even then, only if you have that specific Class A computer. Again, they really haven't said a lot about blades other than they'll eventually have them and they'll do useful stuff, amongst which will be controlling turrets. But they'll do other stuff too. So if you get the turret controlling variety, you're making a choice, a sacrifice somewhere else. Is it worth it? Don't know yet. Maybe. But CIG has said a few times now that a blade will never be better than a person. Of course, I've flown with some pretty bad turret gunners, so checkmate CIG, but I get what they're saying. I'm sure, like the NPCs, they'll have different levels of blades, and if you want the really, really good ones, that'll cost a lot. Also, and this is something most people don't consider, or at least I haven't heard brought up often, their components themselves. They'll be subject to wear and tear, overheating, destruction, so on. In other words, I don't think AI blades will be the I win button solo players are hoping for. Maybe in a smaller ship like a Freelancer or Cuddy? Don't know. And gang, that's all I got for this one. Wow, did this one run long. Thanks for sticking it out. Let me know what your thoughts are below. Think I'm on target? Way off? Think there's other solutions that I missed? Think there's other solutions that you'd like to see implemented? Let me know down below. Catch you next time.